My name is Terry Lawson. I'm 52 years old, a lieutenant general in the United States Army. And I've learned that not all battles begin in trenches. Some begin in the quiet spaces between church bells. My father, a war hero with a chest full of medals, lay in front of the altar, and I, standing at his funeral, received a single message: don't react. Your sister is recording. Within seconds, silence became a weapon sharper than any rifle I've ever held. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Share it in the comments, because even if our paths are different, pain and strength sound the same everywhere. The air in the church in Bethesda, Maryland, was thick with the scent of old beeswax and aging wood. It was a cold, late autumn day, and the stained glass windows, once so vibrant in the sun, now cast a weak, fractured light onto the pews. The colors were muted, the light was pale. It was a perfect reflection of the day, a solemn, somber affair. The church was silent, a vast, hallowed space filled with the collective grief of my family and my father's friends. But the silence wasn't a comfort. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled. The hum was here, too, a low, ominous frequency that had followed me here. It was the sound of a lie waiting to be born. On the altar, a mahogany casket stood before us. It was a monument of quiet dignity. On top of it, a flag folded with military precision, its sharp creases a testament to a life of duty. I stood at attention, my posture a reflection of my training, my face a mask of cold composure. I held a small, black velvet box in my hand. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was my father's Purple Heart, the one he received for his service in Vietnam. The cold glass of its display case felt heavy, a symbolic weight of his sacrifice and my duty. It was a tangible piece of our family history, an object that held the weight of honor. I was the one who was meant to hold it, to carry it. I felt the weight of it, not just in my hands, but in my soul. I was his heir, the keeper of his legacy. But I knew, standing there, that my right to hold it was being questioned. My sister, Rachel, all brittle resentment and manufactured grief, stood beside me. She was dressed in a dark suit, a grim expression on her face. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but I could see the subtle flicker of her phone screen. I had just received a text from a trusted contact in the Secretary of the Navy's office, a man who represented the quiet authority I had come to trust. His message was a single, stark command: don't react. Your sister is filming. I didn't need to look. I knew what she was doing. She was waiting for me to break, to flinch, to show some kind of crack in my composure. She was waiting to capture the moment of my downfall, a moment she could use as evidence of my instability. My focus shifted from the casket to the quiet battlefield I was standing on. My training took over. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I felt the collective hum of doubt ripple through the pews. There were whispers now, murmurs from my extended family. I heard someone say, she got her promotion because her father pulled strings. Another voice, they say she's all command but useless in real life. The words hit like invisible daggers, designed to pierce not my skin but my honor. I stood still, a soldier under a different kind of fire. My father's legacy, my life's work, was on the line. They had been building this moment for months. They had laid a silent trail of rumors and half-truths, a low hum of gossip that had grown louder with every passing week. My family, the very people I had left to protect a nation, were the ones trying to dismantle me, to question my honor. My years of service, my hard-won rank, my very identity as a soldier, all of it was at risk. But I remained still. I let my silence speak for me. My discipline, honed over decades of service, was a fortress. They had misread my calm. They had misinterpreted my quiet presence. They thought my silence was an admission of guilt. They thought it was weakness. They didn't know it was strategy. They didn't know it was a weapon. I was a general, and this was my battlefield. The enemy was in plain sight, and I was holding the line. But that wasn't the whole story. The story didn't begin with a funeral. It began with two girls in a small brick house in Annapolis, Maryland. It began with family dinners and the smell of my mother's roast chicken. For my sister Rachel and me, the hum was different. For her, it was a constant, buzzing need for attention. For me, it was a low, steady sound of being overlooked. My father was a hero. His chest was full of medals, and his stories were the bedtime tales of my childhood. But his presence was a distant, almost mythic force. He was a general, a leader, a man who gave his life to his country. My mother, a quiet, formidable woman, managed our home and our lives. And my sister, Rachel, was the one who craved his attention the most. She was a loud, dramatic child, constantly vying for my father's approval. She'd bring home perfect report cards and showy art projects, a desperate plea for him to look at her. When she didn't get the reaction she wanted, a crack would appear in her composure, a small flicker of resentment that I couldn't quite understand. I was the opposite. I was a quiet child. I was the one who would sit in my father's study, looking at his old maps and his medals. He taught me about strategy, about discipline, about holding the line. He never said the words, but he knew I was listening. He knew I was internalizing his lessons. My father's attention was a quiet, steady thing. He would just look at me, and I would feel seen, as if I were a secret he was keeping. It was our private language, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. Our family dinners were a constant source of quiet conflict. A knife would scrape against a plate, a fork would be dropped, a sudden, loud laugh from Rachel. Those were the microaggressions of a life built on her need for more. I heard her say it all the time, a low hum under her breath, "You got promoted because Dad played favorites." It wasn't true, of course. My father was a man of strict principle. He never played favorites. He taught me that honor was a quiet force. He was a man of quiet authority. But Rachel's narrative was built on a foundation of perceived injustice. She believed she was overlooked for me, that I had something she didn't. I left for the army at 18. I didn't have a big party or a dramatic send-off. I just packed a bag, put on my uniform, and left. My father gave me a silent nod of approval. My mother gave me a hug that spoke volumes. Rachel didn't even look up from her phone. She just said, "You're choosing this over us? Fine." The words were a quiet dagger, but they didn't penetrate. I was on a mission, a path I had chosen for myself. The years passed. The quiet, constant exclusion continued. I would call home, and Rachel would give me short, clipped answers. "We had to suffer so he could love you more." She believed my success was built on her sacrifice. She believed that my discipline, my quiet strength, was an act of coldness, a way of leaving them behind. She didn't see the countless nights I spent awake in a foreign country, the silent conversations I had with myself. She only saw the distance. When my father became ill, I came home. I was a ghost to them, a stranger in my own home. My father, frail and thin, took my hand. He looked at me, and his eyes held the same silent pride I had always known. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He knew that I was the one who had truly held the line. He knew I was the one who would protect what he had built. He looked at Rachel, who was talking loudly on the phone, and his eyes held a flicker of sadness. He knew something I didn't. He knew the fracture was coming. He knew that one day my silent strength would be tested. Until that night. The humiliation was a slow, deliberate performance. After the funeral, we all gathered at a reception hall in Arlington, Virginia. The air was loud with the buzz of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of grief. I stood in a corner, talking quietly to a few of my father's former colleagues. I was a quiet pillar of strength, a general in a room full of civilians. My uniform, my presence, was a testament to my honor. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Rachel moved through the crowd, a forced smile on her face. I saw her talking to family friends, the ones who had watched us grow up. She would lean in, her voice low, a confidential whisper. Her movements were a rehearsed grace, a dance of deception. I saw the faces of the people she was talking to change, from a look of shared grief to a flicker of suspicion. The hum in the room was growing louder, a mix of 1,000 conversations, now layered with an undercurrent of gossip. I saw Dana, a childhood friend, standing in the corner. Dana was a childhood friend, a person who represented loyalty and an unwavering sense of right and wrong. She was my warm steel. She gave me a look that was both empathetic and pained. She had heard the rumors. The lie was spreading. Rachel approached me. She came to a halt in front of me, her smile gone, replaced by a cold, cutting stare. She leaned in, her voice a low, theatrical whisper meant for my ears, but just loud enough for the people around us to hear. "You command soldiers," she said, her voice laced with venom. "But in real life? Useless." The words were a quiet, vicious jab. A silent ripple of shock went through the people who heard her. I didn't flinch. My face was a mask of cold composure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show anger. I simply looked at her, my eyes a firm, unblinking glare. I was a general surveying enemy movement. No anger. Just a cold, precise calculation. The moment was a frozen frame in my memory. The hum of the room was now a low, angry roar. The faces of the people around us were a blur of judgment and doubt. Their grief was being replaced by a morbid curiosity. I saw a man from a local news station, a man I had given interviews to countless times, now looking at me with a questioning expression. The flicker of the camera on his phone was a new kind of threat. I could feel a physical stress reaction. My heart was pounding, a hard, frantic drum against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My hands, which were still holding my father's purple heart, began to tremble. But I didn't drop it. I held on tight. My physical reaction was a silent battle, a war that no one else could see. But my discipline held. My training was a lifeline. I had learned to channel that panic into a cold, hard focus. I was not a woman in mourning. I was a soldier under siege. I gave Rachel one last glance. It wasn't a look of hatred, but a look of discernment. I was watching her. I was seeing the cracks in her facade, the brittle resentment that was finally breaking. And then I walked away. I walked through the crowd, through the loud, humming chaos of the room, and out into the cold Virginia night. The sodium lights of the street lamps cast a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. I leaned against a cold brick wall, my breath coming in short, gasping sobs. The hum of the room was replaced by the low thrum of the city, the gentle growl of cars passing by. It was the hum of a world that didn't care, a city that was indifferent to my pain. I was out there, alone, a general who had been publicly stripped of her honor, and there was nothing I could do. I drove all night, the car a small, metal bubble of silence in a world that felt like it was crumbling around me. I made it to my home office, a quiet space in my DC apartment, just as the sun was rising. My life was here, in this room. My maps, my books, my strategies. It was my war room. But it felt different now. The silence in the room was a deafening presence, a crushing weight. The hum was gone, replaced by a deep, suffocating emptiness. It was the sound of a trust collapsing. I had received a confidential packet from a trusted contact, an ally from my military past. Inside, it contained a series of documents, audio recordings, and bank transfers. My hands trembled as I opened it. Each page was a new, brutal betrayal. I saw documents with my father's forged signature, fake bank transfers from his accounts to Rachel's, and email chains where Rachel and her attorney were planning this entire operation. The words "breach of kin" were scrawled on one of the documents. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. It was more than a legal term. It was a brutal summary of the emotional wreckage they had created. I sat there for hours, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal. The silence in the room was not just a lack of sound. It was a character. It was a ghost that haunted me, a reflection of the trust that was now gone. The loss wasn't just a family. It was a legacy. It was the memory of a father's love, of a childhood built on stories of honor and sacrifice. It was all gone, replaced by this cold, brutal reality. I thought about Rachel, the sister I had loved, the girl who had once sat on my father's lap and listened to his stories. She had taken all of that, all of our shared history, and she had weaponized it against me. She had taken my love for my father and her own festering resentment, and she had turned it into a public spectacle. The hum of a life I once knew was now just a silent, empty space. A chasm had opened between us, and it was too wide to cross. The tears finally came, not in a torrent, but in a quiet, steady stream. I let them fall, but I didn't make a sound. My grief was silent, my anger was silent, my vengeance was silent. My silence, which had once been a shield, was now my fire. I made a silent vow to the stranger I saw in the dark reflection of my office window. I would not yell. I would not explain. I would not defend. I would just act. I had a different set of weapons now. And the first one was patience. I was a general who had learned to watch and wait. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. So I began to watch and wait. The months that followed were a Cold War. The rumors continued, the whispers grew louder, but I didn't respond. I didn't engage. My silence was a fortress, a high-tech armor that could not be breached. I let them talk. I let them create their narrative. I let the public hum of their gossip fill the air. I knew the truth was a different kind of weapon, a silent missile that would find its target. The hum was different now. It was no longer a roar of public shame. It was a low, steady thrum of anticipation. It was the quiet sound of a system under pressure, a system that was starting to fail. The flicker in the light was no longer a sign of betrayal. It was a signal, a sign of a coming truth. The spark came from an unexpected place. A package arrived at my office. It was from Dana, my childhood friend, the one I had seen at the funeral. Inside, there was no flash drive. There was a crumpled purple paper crown, a relic from our childhood games, and a small, handwritten letter. I unfolded the paper crown. On the inside, in her familiar handwriting, were 2 words, "I'm sorry." I turned it over, and there, scrawled in my own childlike hand, were the words, "I want you to be strong." I had written those words for her. She had kept it for all these years. I opened her letter. It was a confession, not from her, but from Rachel. It was a confession of her own. Rachel had sent a message to Dana, a message she wanted her to give to me. She was asking for forgiveness, not from me, but from Dana. The words were simple, and they cut through all the noise. "I was wrong," she had written. "Use this." The message was not of war, but of admission. Of surrender. I went to my final hearing. The air was tense. Rachel and her attorney, a woman who reeked of rehearsed grace, were ready for a fight. They had prepared their narrative of my being a fake, a fraud. My lawyer, a man who had the quiet power of a lifetime of service, didn't say a word. He just placed a new folder on the judge's desk. It was the same folder I had held at my father's funeral. Inside, it contained all the evidence I had collected. The bank transfers, the emails, the forged documents. The judge, a man who had seen it all, read the documents. His face, usually a mask of neutrality, began to change. He looked from the documents to Rachel, to her attorney, and then finally to me. The hum in the courtroom seemed to stop. The flicker in the lights was a sudden blackout. The judge looked at the courtroom, at the media, at the gallery. Then he looked at Rachel. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have a choice. You can admit to your actions here, or you can let the full force of the law determine your fate." Rachel's face, which had been a mask of defiance, finally broke. The cracks I had seen in her childhood were now a full-blown fracture. She looked at her attorney, and her rehearsed grace finally broke. It was a flicker of fear, a flicker of panic. It was a face reveal. The mask had come off. My lawyer spoke then, his voice cutting through the silence. "Your Honor, we have evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud my client and the estate of her late father." He then explained, concisely, the contents of the flash drive I had collected. The room went silent. Rachel's face drained of all color. She looked at her attorney, and her expression of practiced grace finally broke. It was a flicker of fear, a flicker of panic. It was a face reveal. The mask had come off. The judge looked at the court police. "Close the doors," he said. "No one moves." From that moment, the balance was mine. The truth, once released, cannot be contained. The arrests followed, not just for Rachel, but for her attorney and a few others involved. The public reaction was swift and merciless. They were the ones who were now branded as frauds, as liars. The narrative was flipped, the story rewritten. But I didn't gloat. I didn't go to the media. I didn't make a victory lap. I had what I needed. Quiet justice. I went back to the small, unassuming Veterans Hall in my old neighborhood in Annapolis. It was a place of quiet dignity, a place where the hum was the sound of quiet conversation and the soft clink of a coffee cup. I stood at a podium, not in a fancy ballroom, but in a small room filled with men and women who had served. I wasn't there to give a speech. I was there to tell the truth. I spoke, not to punish, but to honor. My tone was even, factual, and devastating. I spoke about the truth of honor, of sacrifice, and of duty. I used a military metaphor to explain my journey. We are the silent force, I said, my voice low and steady. We protect what matters, not with volume, but with precision. I didn't mention Rachel's name. I didn't need to. Her fate was in the hands of the law. My silence became a march of justice, a steady, deliberate step forward. I had learned to build new boundaries. I didn't answer calls from extended family members who had sided with Rachel. I didn't respond to the emails that now begged for my forgiveness. The silence, which had once been a weapon, was now a sanctuary. I had learned to discern between the people who deserved my energy and the ones who didn't. My alliance was with Dana. She was the only one who had reached out. She came to my house and just sat with me in the living room. We didn't talk much. We just sat in the quiet. The silence was a new kind of language for us. It was a language of understanding, of shared pain, of shared loyalty. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was a new kind of hum, a low, steady sound of friendship. The old hum, the one of betrayal and public shame, was gone. It was replaced by a new hum, a quiet rhythm of rebuilding and renewal. I had won the war, not with a loud victory, but with a quiet, dignified recovery. I had found a new kind of strength, a strength that was rooted in loyalty, in purpose, and in the quiet of my own heart. There was still one last chapter to close. The final chapter wasn't a public trial. It was a small, almost silent note. I received a letter from Rachel from prison. It was short. 2 sentences. I was wrong. I was always wrong. I didn't feel vindication. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt peace. The hum was gone. The flicker had faded. There was only a quiet stillness. The quiet of a new life. Today, I woke up at dawn. The air was cool and smelled of dew and freshly cut grass. The sun was a soft, pale gold, just beginning to touch the rolling hills of Arlington. I walked to my father's grave. I stood there, a silent sentinel, a general who had finally come home. I placed the Purple Heart pin gently onto the headstone. I whispered 2 words. I held the line. The emotional tone of the final scene was a quiet, grounded one. I was at peace. I was walking forward, not with vengeance, but with clarity and loyalty. I had come full circle. I had walked through the fire, and I had emerged not burned, but purified. The silence wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a sanctuary. It was a symbol of my strength. My story isn't about winning a battle. It's about a deeper, more profound kind of victory. It's about the quiet, disciplined comeback. It's about finding justice not in a courtroom, but in the quiet of your own heart. It's about holding the line, even when you're standing alone. Silence isn't denial. It's strategy. Justice doesn't need shouting, just steady steps. Healing begins with quiet action. My battle was fought not with a rifle, but with a silent, disciplined will to survive. I have found my way back from betrayal. And you can too. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.